My name is Amara Diallo. I am 39 years old. I have a doctorate in neuroscience from Stanford. I run a research laboratory at a medical university in Boston that studies the neurological basis of trauma recovery, and I have spent the last 11 years doing work that my mother still describes at family gatherings as something with the brain. Last November, my research team published a paper in the journal Nature Neuroscience that was described by 3 independent researchers in the field as a potential paradigm shift in how we understand trauma's effect on memory consolidation. The paper was picked up by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and 17 international science publications. My mother called me the morning the Times article ran and said she had seen my name in the newspaper and wanted to know if I was in trouble. I told her I was not in trouble. I told her the paper had been published and it was receiving attention. She said that was nice, that she had always known I was smart, and then she asked if I was eating enough and whether I had met anyone. I told her I was eating enough. The question about meeting someone I deflected the way I have deflected it for 20 years, with a comfortable vagueness that buys time without closing doors. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment in Cambridge and thought about the gap that had existed between my mother's understanding of my life and my actual life for as long as I had been an adult. And I thought about what it would take to close it. And I thought about whether I wanted to try. This is the story of what I decided, and what happened when I acted on the decision, and why the conversation I had with my mother in her kitchen in Atlanta last Christmas was the most important conversation of my adult life. My mother Fatima came to the United States from Senegal in 1979. She was 22 years old. She came to join her husband, my father Ibrahim, who had arrived 2 years earlier and had found work at a textile company in Georgia, while building the contacts that would eventually allow him to open his own import business. They settled in Atlanta. My father's business grew steadily through the 1980s and 1990s and is still operating, now managed by my older brother Musa, and it provided my family with a stability that was real and that I do not take for granted. My mother worked as a seamstress, then as a teacher's aide, then eventually as a childcare worker, and she did all of these things with the same quality, thoroughness, warmth, and a precision about the things that mattered to her that I recognized, even as a child, as a form of intelligence that did not require formal credentials to express itself. She raised 4 children in a household that ran on her capacity for organization and her sense of what each child needed, which was different for each of us, and which she managed simultaneously with a skill that I have come to appreciate more as I have gotten older and understood better what it requires. I am the youngest of 4. My sister Kadiatu is a pharmacist. My brother Cheikh is a dentist. My brother Musa runs the family business. And then there is me, who went to Stanford for a PhD in neuroscience and spent a decade studying trauma, which is, in the framework my parents brought to evaluating their children's achievements, both the most impressive credential and the least legible outcome. I decided I wanted to study the brain at 14, which is a strange decision at 14, and which I did not fully understand myself until I was in graduate school and had the vocabulary to articulate what had driven it. What happened at 14 was that I read a book, a popular science book about neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself in response to experience, and I had the experience that I later learned is described in the scientific literature as an aha moment, but which felt at the time more like the slow arrival of something that had been present but unformed finally becoming visible. The book was not particularly sophisticated by the standards of the field, but it was clear enough to communicate a central idea that reorganized everything I had been thinking about without knowing I was thinking about it. The idea was that experience shapes the physical structure of the brain, and that the shaping is not fixed but dynamic, and that understanding the mechanisms of this shaping could potentially reveal how the brain recovers from damage, and how that recovery could be facilitated or impeded. I read the book 3 times. I found other books. I found my biology teacher, a woman named Mrs. Okonkwo, who had a master's degree in biochemistry, and who was doing more than her salary required her to do at a public high school in Atlanta. And I asked her questions that went past what she could answer, and she pointed me toward resources that went past what she had covered. She was the first adult outside my family who treated my curiosity as something worth investing time in. And I have thought about her regularly throughout my career in the way that you think about the people who opened doors you did not know were there. My parents' response to my interest in neuroscience was complicated in ways that I want to describe fairly. My father Ibrahim responded with curiosity that was genuine, but limited by the technical distance between his own field and mine. He asked questions about what I would study and what the career looked like, and whether there were jobs, which are the questions of a businessman evaluating an investment, and which are not wrong questions even if they do not capture the full picture. He was supportive in the sense that he did not discourage me, and he paid for my undergraduate education at Emory without complaint. And he came to my college graduation and my master's graduation, and would have come to my doctoral graduation at Stanford if he had not had a health complication that kept him in Atlanta that month. My mother's response was different in a way that took me years to fully understand. She was proud of me. I do not question this. Her pride was real and consistent, and expressed in the ways she expressed everything, which was through action and attention rather than through statement. But she was proud of me the way she was proud of all her children, in a register that was about the fact of achievement rather than the nature of it. She understood that I was doing something at a high level. She did not understand what the something was, and the gap between those two things, between knowing that your child is successful and understanding what the success consists of, is the gap I have been trying to close. For most of my adult life, Stanford was the beginning of the real work. And the real work was different from anything I had encountered before in a way that was both exhilarating and disorienting. My advisor, Dr. Sarah Chen, was one of the leading researchers in the field of memory consolidation, the process by which experiences are encoded in long-term memory, and she had a specific research interest in how traumatic experiences are encoded differently from non-traumatic ones. The question that animated her work, and that became the question animating mine, was why traumatic memories are so persistent, so easily retrieved, so resistant to the normal processes by which we integrate experience and move on. The question matters not as an academic puzzle, but as a clinical one. The persistence and intrusiveness of traumatic memories is the core feature of post-traumatic stress disorder, which affects millions of people and which we are still not very good at treating. Understanding the neurological mechanism is the necessary precondition for developing better treatments. And developing better treatments is the necessary precondition for reducing the suffering of people who cannot escape the memories of what has happened to them. I chose this work not by accident, and not purely by intellectual interest, though the intellectual interest was real. I chose it because I was the child of immigrants who had left a country to build something new. And immigrants carry things from where they came from that do not always translate neatly. And some of what they carry is the residue of difficulty. And I had grown up in a household that contained that residue in ways that were present but not discussed, and that I had spent a long time trying to understand without the right tools. Neuroscience gave me the tools. What I discovered was more than I had expected. The years of my PhD program were the years I learned what scientific work actually is, as opposed to what I had thought it was before I was inside it. Before graduate school, science looked from the outside like the progressive accumulation of knowledge. You study what is known, you do experiments that extend what is known, you publish the extension. From inside, it looks different. It looks like the management of uncertainty at a scale that is often alarming. In a context where the uncertainty is not temporary but structural, where the thing you are trying to understand is so complex that the ratio of what is known to what is unknown remains discouraging for very long periods, and only occasionally shifts in the direction of clarity. What I learned in graduate school was not primarily the content of neuroscience, though I learned a great deal of that. What I learned was how to work inside that uncertainty without being paralyzed by it, how to make the best decisions possible given incomplete information, how to design experiments that could move you incrementally toward a hypothesis rather than proving it directly, how to revise your thinking when the data told you something different from what you had predicted, and how to maintain the motivation to continue when the progress was slow, and the failures were frequent, and the external validation that most people need to sustain effort was sporadic. These are not skills that are explicitly taught. They are built through the experience of doing the work and failing at it, and continuing and failing again, and learning from each failure in ways that are cumulative even when they do not feel cumulative. I came out of the PhD program with all of these skills in a partial form. The rest of the time since then has been the process of developing them further. I want to tell you about the research that led to the Nature Neuroscience paper, because understanding what it is and why it matters is the only way to understand what my mother's difficulty understanding it has actually cost in terms of what the work represents. For 20 years, the scientific consensus on how traumatic memories are encoded in the brain has centered on a specific network of structures, primarily the amygdala and the hippocampus, and a specific mechanism by which threatening experiences trigger a neurochemical cascade that causes those experiences to be encoded with an intensity and durability that non-threatening experiences do not receive. This framework is well established and has generated important insights. What my laboratory found, over 8 years of work involving a combination of animal models and human neuroimaging studies, is that the encoding mechanism is more complex than this framework suggests. Specifically, that there is a secondary process involving a region called the prefrontal cortex that modulates the primary encoding in ways that were not previously understood, and that the variability in this secondary process explains a significant portion of the variability in why some people who experience trauma develop persistent symptoms and others do not. This is not a complete explanation of trauma. Trauma is one of the most complex phenomena the brain produces, and anyone who claims to have a complete explanation of it is either wrong or misunderstood. But it is a meaningful contribution to the partial explanation, and the implications for treatment design are genuine. If you understand the prefrontal modulation process, you can potentially develop interventions that support it in people whose natural modulation is insufficient. This is what my laboratory has been working toward. This is what my mother describes as something with the brain. My personal life during the years of building the laboratory deserves the honest treatment I have been trying to apply to everything else in this story. I have been in 2 significant relationships as an adult. The first was during my postdoctoral years, with a man named Thomas who was an economist at Harvard, and who was in most respects an excellent person with whom I was fundamentally incompatible in the ways that take time to reveal themselves. We were together for 3 years and ended things with mutual clarity rather than mutual bitterness, which is the best possible outcome of an incompatible relationship. The second was more recent, a relationship with a woman named Claire, who is a physician specializing in trauma surgery at MGH, which is a relationship that has now been ongoing for 5 years and which I am going to come back to because it is relevant to the story I am building toward. I have not told my mother about Claire. This is a decision I made not out of shame. I do not experience my relationship as something to be ashamed of, but out of a combination of uncertainty about my mother's response and exhaustion with the ongoing work of managing the gap between her understanding of my life and my actual life. The gap in her understanding of my work has been one sustained effort. Adding the gap in her understanding of who I love felt, for a long time, like more than I had the capacity to manage simultaneously. I am telling you this because the Christmas conversation I mentioned at the beginning of this story was about both gaps at once, and the convergence of them in a single conversation was not something I had planned, but something that happened because the truth has a tendency to find its way out when you stop actively managing its containment. The laboratory's first years were years of building in the most literal sense, building the physical space, building the team, building the research agenda, and building the administrative infrastructure that keeps a research laboratory running. I was 31 when I started the lab, which is young for a principal investigator, and which meant I was doing the work of building while simultaneously doing the work of establishing credibility, in a field where credibility is built slowly and through the publication record that takes years to develop. My first significant grant was from the National Institute of Mental Health, a 5-year award that funded the first generation of experiments and paid the salaries of my first 2 postdoctoral researchers and 3 graduate students. The grant was competitive, and I was proud of receiving it, and I called my mother to tell her. She said she was proud of me. She asked how much it was. I told her. She said that was a lot of money. I said it was not mine. It was funding for the research, which paid for equipment and personnel and operations. She said, "Oh, I see," in the way you say, "Oh, I see," when you do not see but are not going to admit it. I did not push past the surface of this response, because I had learned by then that pushing past the surface of my mother's responses required more than a phone call. It required a kind of sustained conversation that was difficult to achieve at the physical distance we maintained and in the rhythms of both of our lives. I filed it away and moved on. This filing away and moving on was the pattern of our relationship for most of my 30s, and it worked in the sense that it sustained the connection without rupturing it, and it cost in the sense that the connection it sustained was not the complete version of either of us. The publication in Nature Neuroscience was the moment that made the decision for me about the Christmas visit. I had been thinking about having the conversation with my mother for years, the conversation that contained both the work and Claire and the accumulated distance of 2 decades of partial communication, and I had been not having it for all of those Years for reasons that were not cowardice exactly, but were adjacent to it. The publication changed the calculus because it created a moment of external legibility that I realized I could use as a bridge. If my mother could not understand the work from my description of it, she might be able to receive the description of it from a national newspaper, which is a form of validation that operates in a language she has always understood. I sent her the Times article before I called her. Then I called her. The conversation I described at the beginning of this story was the first conversation. What I am building toward is the second one, which happened in December, in person, in her kitchen in Atlanta, and which could only happen after the first one had shifted something in the atmosphere between us. I drove to Atlanta in December. I had not told my mother I was coming in advance, which I did deliberately and which I want to explain. If I had told her in advance, she would have prepared, she would have cooked and cleaned and organized and invited the extended family and filled the days with the social structure that is her natural response to a visit, and the visit I needed to have required space that social structure would have eliminated. I called her from the airport when I landed and told her I was coming and that I wanted it to be just us. She said, of course, and then she paused and said, "Is something wrong?" And I said, "No, nothing was wrong. I just wanted time that was just the two of us." She accepted this, and I drove to the house, and she opened the door, and she looked at me with the expression of a mother who has calculated that something is happening and has decided to let it arrive in its own time rather than accelerate it. We had dinner. We talked about my siblings and my father's health and the family business. After dinner, we sat at the kitchen table, which is where the most important conversations in my family have always happened, and my mother made tea, and then she sat down across from me and said, "Tell me what's going on." I started with the work. I decided to start with the work because the work was the more legible of the two things I needed to say, and because beginning with legibility gave the conversation a foundation before I moved to harder ground. I had thought about how to explain the research in terms that did not require a background in neuroscience, and what I had arrived at was an explanation built around the thing the research was ultimately about, which is human suffering and the possibility of reducing it. I told her about a patient, not from my own practice, because I am a researcher, not a clinician, but from the clinical literature, a veteran who had been in combat and who could not sleep, who relived the events of his worst days with a vividness and a physical intensity that made each recurrence feel as real as the original. I told her this patient had tried every available treatment and had received partial relief from some and none from others, and had been living inside this particular suffering for years. Then I told her what my research was trying to understand, not the suffering itself, which we could describe, but the mechanism inside the brain that produced the persistence of it, because understanding the mechanism was the first step toward designing a treatment that could interrupt it. I watched my mother's face while I talked. She was listening in the specific way she listens when something is landing rather than passing over her hand still on the table, her eyes focused, the particular quality of attention I recognized from childhood when she was truly engaged with something. When I finished the patient's story, she said, "So the work is to help people like that man stop living in the worst thing that happened to them?" I said yes. That was exactly what the work was. She nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone who has understood something and is taking a moment to allow the understanding to settle. "Why didn't you say it like that before?" she asked. I said I hadn't known she needed it that way. "I always needed it that way," she said. "I just didn't know how to ask." The second thing I needed to say was harder, and I want to be honest about the difficulty because minimizing it would be dishonest, and dishonesty serves no purpose in this account. I told my mother about Claire. I did not build up to it with a long preamble. I said that I was in a relationship that had been serious for 5 years, and that I had not told her about it, and that I wanted to tell her now. My mother's face shifted in a way that I cannot fully describe. It moved through something that was not quite surprise, and was not quite recognition, and was not quite fear, and it arrived somewhere that was simply present, simply there, waiting for what came next. I told her Claire's name. I told her she was a physician. I told her she was a woman. I waited. My mother looked at her tea. She was quiet for a long time, not the quiet of someone who is processing anger, which I had feared and had prepared for, but the quiet of someone who is doing the genuine work of updating something fundamental. Then she said, "Is she good to you?" I said yes. She said, "Does she make you happy?" I said she did. My mother picked up her tea. She took a sip. Then she said something I did not expect, something that arrived from a place I had not anticipated, delivered in the plain voice she uses for things she has thought about carefully. I have been saying prayers for years that you would find someone. I should have been more specific in my prayers. There was a beat of silence. Then we both laughed at the same time, and the laughter was genuine, and it released something that had been held tight for a very long time. And the releasing of it changed the quality of everything that followed. What followed that evening was the longest sustained conversation my mother and I had ever had as adults. And I want to try to describe its quality because the quality matters as much as the content. It was not a single linear progression from problem to resolution. It moved in the way that real conversations move when they are about things that are genuinely complex, forward and sideways and occasionally backward, returning to things that had been said earlier to look at them from a different angle, following threads that led somewhere unexpected and then coming back to the main current. My mother asked about Claire's family and whether they knew about me and how I had met her and what she was like as a person. She asked with genuine curiosity, rather than with the interrogative quality of a parent assessing a situation against a checklist of acceptability. I answered everything. I told her about the way Claire worked, which was with a commitment to her patients that I recognized from my own relationship to the research, the same quality of attention, the same refusal to do a partial job. I told her about the specific things that made the relationship work, which are not easy to describe, but which I attempted to describe honestly. And at some point during all of this, my mother said something that I have thought about nearly every day since. She said, "I think I did not see you clearly when you were growing up. I saw that you were smart. I saw that you worked hard. But I did not see what you were actually working toward because what you were working toward was not something I had a picture of." She paused. "I think you have been living a life that was real all along, and I have been seeing the surface of it and calling that the whole thing. I want to pause here and address something that the story might seem to be building toward, that it is not actually building toward." The conversation in my mother's kitchen did not resolve everything. My mother did not emerge from it with a complete understanding of trauma neuroscience and a complete acceptance of my relationship, and a transformed understanding of my life that replaced everything that had come before. That is not what real change looks like. What real change looks like is smaller and more sustained. It looks like the shift in the quality of a relationship that has been operating at less than its full capacity finally beginning to operate closer to capacity, which is a gradual process that is visible only in accumulation. What the conversation did was open something, not finish something, not resolve something, but open something that had been closed. My mother asked about my research at Christmas dinner in a way she had not asked about it before, with specific questions, with the vocabulary I had given her in the kitchen conversation, with the same curiosity she brought to things she genuinely cared about understanding, rather than things she was maintaining a polite interest in. She mentioned Claire by name to my sister Katia too, which was something I had not asked her to do, and which I learned about afterward, and which told me that she had decided this was part of the picture of her daughter's life that she was integrating rather than managing. These are small things. They are also the real things, the things that outlast moments of high emotion, and that constitute the actual texture of a changed relationship. My father's response to the Christmas conversation was different from my mother's, and I want to describe it because it is part of the complete picture. I had not told him separately. My mother had told him before Christmas dinner, with my permission, because she understood that arriving at Christmas dinner with this information for him to process in the context of family gathering was not the right way for him to receive it. He took it the way he takes most things that require him to update a significant assumption, quietly, with a deliberateness that is not coldness, but is the processing style of a man who has spent his life making decisions carefully. He came to find me before dinner, in the small room off the kitchen where I had been helping with food preparation, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said he was glad I had told them, and that he loved me, and that he wanted to meet Claire. That was the whole statement. It was exactly the right statement for who my father is and what our relationship is. I told him Claire would come to Atlanta in the spring. He said good. Then he went back to the living room, and I went back to the food preparation, and we did not speak about it again that day. But the quality of his presence at dinner was different, more at ease, I thought, than it had been at the start of the holiday, as though something that had been held at a slight tension had been released. Claire came to Atlanta in April. This was the first time she had met my family, and the First time my family had seen the complete version of my life. And I want to describe it honestly rather than narratively, because the honest version is more useful than the version organized for effect. The weekend was not perfectly comfortable. There were moments when the social navigation required by introducing a partner to a family that has not previously understood the relationship was real and slightly awkward. And Claire handled these moments with a combination of warmth and directness that I found, watching from the side, genuinely impressive. She spoke to my mother at length about her work, which my mother responded to with genuine curiosity, because medicine is something she understands the value of immediately, and the conversation built a bridge between them that my own work had taken 20 years to begin building. My brother Chake, the dentist, spent 45 minutes talking to Claire about hospital medicine, and the conversation had the quality of two professionals who recognize each other's competence and are relieved to be able to talk about their work with someone who understands it. My brother Musa was quiet and warm in the way he is always quiet and warm, which is its own form of acceptance. My sister Kadiatu took Claire to the kitchen to help with something, and they were in there for 20 minutes, and when they came out they were laughing, which is Kadiatu's way of saying she approves of someone. My mother served tea on the back porch on the last afternoon of the visit and sat with me and Claire together, and the quality of those 2 hours, the ease of them, the absence of the tension I had expected and had been braced for, told me something I had not known to hope for, but am very glad to have. I want to tell you about what the research means to me personally, because I have described it technically, and I have described its significance in the field, and neither of those descriptions captures the third dimension of it, which is the personal one. I grew up in a household that contained difficulty in the way that many immigrant households do. The displacement of leaving a country, the stress of building something new in unfamiliar conditions, the specific grief of distance from extended family and from the culture and language of origin, and the things that are carried forward from generation to generation in the body and in behavior without being named or understood. My parents were not traumatized people in the clinical sense, but they carried things. My mother carried a specific kind of vigilance that I recognized. As I got older and started reading the literature, as the vigilance of someone whose early experience had taught them that safety was conditional and had to be maintained by constant alertness. My father carried a rigidity of framework that served him well in building, but made him less flexible in the face of things that fell outside the framework, and which I now understand as a response to the uncertainty of his early years in America, when the framework was the thing that kept everything organized in conditions that were profoundly disorganizing. I chose to study how the brain encodes and maintains the effects of difficult experience, because I grew up inside the effects of difficult experience, in people who loved me, and I wanted to understand the mechanism. Understanding the mechanism has not resolved the original question. The questions that come from watching people you love carry things they did not choose to carry are not the kind that science resolves. But it has given me a way to hold the question that is better than the way I had before. The laboratory's current state is something I want to describe because this story, like all the lives that go into stories, has not ended but has a present moment that is specific and worth describing. We have 12 researchers, 4 postdoctoral fellows, 6 graduate students, and 2 research staff members who handle the technical and administrative operations of the laboratory. We are in the 3rd year of a 5-year grant from the National Institute of Mental Health that is the largest single award the laboratory has received, and that is funding the expansion of the work, following the Nature Neuroscience paper. We have a collaboration with a clinical team at MGH, Claire's Hospital, which is a coincidence of timing and location that I take as one of the universe's small jokes, that is designing an intervention study based on the laboratory's findings. The intervention study is the thing I am most excited about, because it represents the movement of the basic science findings towards something that might actually help the man I described to my mother in the kitchen, the veteran, and the many people whose suffering resembles his, who need better treatments and who will not have them until the science is translated into the clinical context. Translation takes time. I am trying to speed it up. This is the work I am doing at 39 years old, and that I intend to be doing for a long time. There is something I have been circling around in this story and want to address directly, which is the question of why the gaps in my family's understanding of my life, the gap in understanding the work, the gap in understanding who I loved, lasted as long as they did and cost as much as they cost. The easy version of the answer is that my family had expectations that were rigid and that I was afraid of their disappointment. The more accurate version is that the gaps lasted as long as they did because I maintained them. I made choices, consistently over many years, to not press past the surface of my family's understanding, because pressing past it felt like more than I had the capacity to manage while simultaneously doing the work. I was wrong about this, and not morally wrong, because the choices I made were understandable given what I was managing, but wrong in a practical sense, because the cost of maintaining the gaps accumulated in ways I did not fully account for. The distance between my family's understanding of my life and my actual life was not just a cognitive inconvenience. It was a form of loneliness that sat at the center of my closest relationships and that affected the quality of everything it touched. I was loved by my family and I was not fully known by them. And being loved without being known is its own kind of lonely that does not respond to the evidence of love's presence. What I needed was for the people who loved me to also see me. Getting there required me to make it possible, which required more from me than I had been willing to give for most of my adult life. A colleague of mine named Dr. Marcus Webb, who runs a laboratory at Columbia studying the intersection of social neuroscience and mental health, came to give a seminar at our university last spring, and we had dinner afterward. And during dinner, he said something that I have been thinking about since in the context of this story. He said that the most under-acknowledged finding in his area of research was the relationship between social connection and neurological health, specifically, that the experience of being seen and understood by others appears to activate the same reward circuits as other forms of pleasure, and that chronic deficits in being seen and understood have measurable neurological effects that are distinct from the effects of loneliness in the social sense. I said I found this consistent with my own work on how the social environment modulates the brain's response to stress. He said yes, but more than that. He said the feeling of being known by the people who matter to you is not just pleasant, it is neurologically necessary in a way we are only beginning to understand. I thought about my family. I thought about 20 years of being loved by people who did not fully know me. I thought about the Christmas kitchen and what happened after I told my mother the truth. Marcus is right, which is the specific satisfaction of a scientific conversation with a colleague who is right. And the implication of his being right is something I am still working through. My mother called me last month on a Tuesday, which is not our usual call time, and when I answered, she was excited in a way I could hear in the first sentence. She had been to a presentation at her church. Her church runs a series of community education events on health topics, and the presenter had been talking about PTSD and had mentioned recent research on the neurological mechanisms of trauma memory, and my mother had recognized the description of the research as what I did. She called me to tell me that she had understood the presentation and that she had said to the woman sitting next to her that her daughter did that research, and that the woman had been impressed. I listened to all of this with a feeling that I am going to try to describe accurately. It was not the feeling I would have had in my 20s, which would have been a mixture of validation and pain. Validation that she was finally seeing the work. Pain that it had taken this long and required a stranger's presentation for the bridge to form. What I felt was simpler than that. I felt glad. Glad that she was excited. Glad that the bridge existed now, and that things were moving across it in both directions. Glad that 20 years of doing the work had produced something that my mother could encounter in the community and recognize as hers. None of this is what I was working toward when I chose this field, and it does not change what I am working toward. But it is real and it is good, and I did not have to give up anything to receive it. Claire and I have been talking about the future in the specific way that people talk about the future when they have been together long enough to know they are building toward something, but have not yet decided the specific shape of what they are building toward. I do not know where we will be in 5 years with precision. I know where the research is going. I know what the laboratory needs. I know that I am committed to Boston for the foreseeable future, and that Claire is committed to MGH, and that these two commitments are compatible. I know that my family is now part of the picture we are building together, that Claire has been to Atlanta twice since April, and that my mother texts her photographs of recipes she thinks Claire might like, which is my mother's specific language of acceptance, and which Claire receives with a genuine warmth that tells me she understands what she is receiving. I know that I am 39 years old, and that whatever comes next will be built on a foundation that is more complete than what I had before the December conversation, and that completeness has a quality that I did not know I was missing until I had it. I am also aware that the future is not fixed, that the things I am most certain about have surprised me before, and that the appropriate relationship to the future is one of committed uncertainty, which is not very different from the appropriate relationship to a research question. You form the best hypothesis you can, you design the best experiment you can, and you remain genuinely open to being wrong, because being open to being wrong is the only way to be right about something that matters. I want to say something directly to anyone who is reading this and who recognizes in my story something from their own life, the experience of doing work that the people who love you cannot access, or of being in a relationship that the people who love you do not know about, or both. What I want to say is not that you should do what I did, or that the path I took is the right path for your situation. Every family is different, and every person's capacity is different, and the calculation of what to share and when is genuinely complicated, and I do not pretend otherwise. What I want to say is something more specific than advice, which is a description of what I found on the other side of the conversation I had been avoiding for 20 years. What I found was not the catastrophe I had been protecting against. My mother did not reject me. She did not reject my work or my partner or the life I had built. What she did was begin to see it, imperfectly and incrementally, and in the ways that were available to her, given who she is. And the beginning of being seen by her created something in me that I had not known was missing. Not a relief exactly, though there was relief in it, but something more like completion. The sense of carrying a full life into the presence of the people you love and having them receive it, even partially, even imperfectly, is something I did not know I needed as much as I did until I finally had it. I am going to end where things are now, in the present, which is the only honest place to end a story that is not finished. I am 39 years old. I am in the third year of a 5-year grant doing the most important research of my career. I have a partner I love who is doing important work of her own, and who is now part of my family's life in a way that feels permanent and real. My mother calls me twice a week, which is more than she ever called before December, and the calls are longer and more substantive and more honest than they were before. She asks about the research and about Claire and about the graduate students in my laboratory, and she asks with genuine curiosity rather than with the maintenance of connection that used to characterize our exchanges. My father is well and sends me articles he finds in the newspaper about neuroscience, which arrive by email in the way that my father communicates things he cannot say directly. A forwarded link as a signal that he is paying attention, that what I do has entered his reading, that he is trying to understand by finding more things to understand. Last week, he sent me an article about a clinical trial of a PTSD treatment that the article described as building on basic science findings about prefrontal involvement in trauma memory consolidation. The email that accompanied it said only, "I thought this might be related to your work." It was. It was directly related to my work. I replied with 3 paragraphs explaining how, which is more than I would have written a year ago because a year ago I would not have believed he would read 3 paragraphs. He replied with a question. I am going to call him on Sunday, which is what I do, and I am going to answer the question, and the conversation is going to be longer than the ones we used to have, and something will pass between us in it that could only pass between us now, which is the understanding that the work I have done is the right work, and that the life I have built is the right life, and that the two of us, on either side of a distance that has been slowly closing for 3 years, are finally close enough to reach each other clearly.